Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and we ran this one back in the 90s. Like a lot of people back then, I was a huge fan of X Men, the animated series, and particularly of Rogue. In fact, to this day, Rogue is my favorite female Marvel character of all time. And I had an idea for an original character named Matrix who would have the same powers as Rogue. And I can't remember the specifics now. I think it was maybe Greg Sheets, one of our other game masters, who thought it seemed implausible that two people would have the exact same power if they weren't related. So we changed the character concept a little bit, and Matrix would then become the son of Rogue. I played him in 1996 and he was about 16 years old, and he became an incredibly big deal, even leading the second iteration of our Game World's primary superhero team. But at some point, as is so often the case with fictional characters, we felt the need to do sort of a prequel and explain how Matrix came to be. And that's what today's tale is all about. Also, for whatever reason, we were having trouble getting into the mindset of an adventure set in the Deep South. And eventually, Greg started talking about Smokey and the Bandit, which got me thinking about the Dukes of Hazzard, which I loved as a kid. And so we started to pull inspiration from all of those sources. And for those who don't know, in the late 1970s, there was this sort of fad where there was a lot of movies and TV shows and stuff where it's set in the South and there's a lot of car chases and jumping off of ramps, and it's kind of a rebel subculture kind of thing, which I think was a big part of the Vietnam era, that kind of anti-government sentiment and all that. So so at any rate, that was very popular for the era that this is set in, and oftentimes, that's what our game celebrates, is those trends in pop culture. So at any rate, before we get into it, smash that like button. Make sure you're subscribed. Ring the bell for notifications. And most importantly out of all, leave us a comment. It helps us out on our end with the YouTube algorithm, but even more so, we just love hearing from you guys. We've got an awesome community here, and it's all thanks to you. There's a million other things you could be doing right now, and instead you're here listening to me. So I appreciate you. Thank you so much for being here. So, all that said, let's dive in. The prologue to this one takes place on January 26th of 1979, when Robert, our friendly neighborhood vampire, is driving down a dirt road with an immortal named John Redbridge. And by the way, this is the exact same John Redbridge who recently visited planets like Krynn, Orth, and Toril with a guy named Gary Gygax. At any rate, so now they are in Caldecott County in western Mississippi, driving along in Bob's black 1977 Trans Am. After spending so much time, by the way, in a pre-industrial society, Redbridge enjoys things like a ride through the countryside. He's not taking to 20th century cities very well after everything he's been through. At any rate, all of a sudden, the Trans Am almost collides with a 1969 Dodge Charger with a number 54 painted on the door. This stock car is called Traveler and was named after General Lee's horse. And Traveler is the pride and joy of the blonde haired brother, John Waldron. Riding with him in the Charger was his black haired brother, Tom Waldron. Anyway, so John yells at Bob for almost wrecking Traveler. And Bob cares just as much about his precious Trans Am. Just as Bob and John are about to get into a fight, along comes a local police cruiser driven by the local sheriff. Tom greets the sheriff as Jimmy and says it's just a friendly disagreement, nothing that concerns the law. The sheriff says everything concerns the law. Then he says the Waldron brothers are on probation for running moonshine, and that assault violates the probation. Despite their protests, the sheriff arrests them. He also impounds both the Charger and the Trans Am and tells Bob and Redbridge they need to see the local judge if they want to get it back. He radios for backup, and 2 deputies show up. The skinny one is named Sonny, and the fat one is named Rick. Anyways, so the cops call Jones Towing, and Mr. Jones comes out in a tow truck and takes both cars slowly back to town. The cops also take Bob, Redbridge, and the Waldron brothers before Judge Book, who looks over the credentials of Bob and Redbridge. Bob, by the way, fought on the side of the North in the Civil War. Then at the Battle of New Orleans, he was bitten by a vampire. So now Bob works for a secret government organization called Bureau 13, and as such, they've provided him with some paperwork to back up his identity. John Redbridge is, of course, immortal, and he has worked for the United States government for years. He fought in World War II, and more recently, he fought in Vietnam. So Judge Book sees this and says, "Thank you for your service," which the Waldron brothers hear and bristle at, because from their point of view, again, remember this culture I'm talking about, that's this kind of rebel, anti-government culture, right? So from their point of view, this is a bad thing. And of course, in 1979, a great many people had an extremely dim view of Vietnam and anybody who fought in it. At any rate, just then, in walks Anna Marie Dancanto, who in later years will be the heroine known as Rogue. Anna Marie lives in Caldecott County with her Aunt Carrie. Carrie, in our game world, had married a man named Waldron, who died when a train derailed, leaving behind 2 sons, John and Tom. Anna Marie's parents were Priscilla and Owen. They lived in a hippie commune and tried to use Native American mysticism to reach an ethereal plane known as the Far Banks. And in doing so, they vanished, never to reappear. So Rogue has lived with her Aunt Carrie and her 2 cousins ever since. Anyways, so Rogue yells at Redbridge, telling him to leave her cousins alone. Redbridge says he and Bob promised they didn't do anything. But the Waldron brothers say anybody who works for the government can't be trusted. Just then, the Waldron brothers see that tow truck unhook their car out in front of the building. So the Waldrons quickly run outside and speed off in the Charger. Jimmy, Rick, and Sonny chase them, and Judge Book badmouths the Waldron family. Redbridge asks if they're really that bad, and the judge says that since he's an outsider, he doesn't really understand how a small town works. Bob asks for his Trans Am back, and the judge tells him that he has to appear in court and plead his case. So an annoyed Bob asks if there are any hotels in this town, to which the judge replies that he owns the only hotel in town. He also owns the bank and Book's Bar, which is where Rogue works for him as a waitress. So Bob and Redbridge walk outside, and Rogue approaches them, still angry that her cousins are now wanted men. Redbridge starts making charisma rolls, trying to persuade Rogue to change her mind about him. Bob sees this and knows when it's time to leave. So Bob goes to the hotel. Redbridge remembers what the judge said about her being a waitress, so he asks her if there's any place around here where he could grab a cold beer on a hot day. And Rogue tells him about Book's Bar. So they go there, and she brings him beer after beer. She says she's never met anyone who can drink that much. He says there's a lot she doesn't know about him. So they talk, and he uses the charisma skill, getting good dice roll after good dice roll. He knows that women love to dance, so he asks her if she'd like to dance. The jukebox plays love songs from the 1970s, and the 2 of them start to hit it off. Later that night, while in the woods, he pulls Rogue to him and tries to kiss her. She runs off laughing, and he chases after her, grabbing her by the waist, and they both fall down. He kisses her on the ground, and she says she can't believe this is happening. He says that she's something special, and they kiss again. By the way, some of you are probably wondering why he can touch Rogue with no ill effect. I mentioned earlier that this is the same John Redbridge who recently visited planets like Krynn, Orth, and Toril, and that he is an immortal. According to TSR's old Wrath of the Immortals box set, written by Aaron Alston, he can only be hurt by other immortals. He is completely immune to any and all attacks from a member of any other race other than his own. So Rogue's absorption powers do not work on him, which, from Rogue's point of view, is good news. So suffice it to say, that Matrix character I mentioned at the beginning of this video comes into existence right about now. And since it's early on, Rogue has no idea she's a mother yet. So, a little time passes, and Redbridge is sticking around. Bob leaves in his Trans Am and heads off towards Mardi Gras, which, by the way, was why the two adventurers were in this part of the country to begin with. The Waldron brothers don't like anyone messing around with their cousin, so they tell her to stay away from Redbridge. And when they see Redbridge at Book's bar, they tell him to stay away from her in return. And when Judge Book is at the bar, he urges Redbridge not to get mixed up with the Waldron family. But he says that he can't stay away and that he loves her. Enough time passes that Rogue eventually realizes she's pregnant. So she takes Redbridge out to where they had their date in the woods, and she tells him that he's going to be a father. And she says that she's scared. So he asks her to marry him. He tells her it would make him the happiest man on earth. Rogue asks what her family is going to say, and he says it doesn't matter. She says it matters to her. So Redbridge suggests they have a little get together and make the announcement. He says when the Waldron family knows that it won't be a baby out of wedlock, maybe they won't object then. Maybe if they know that he intends to do the right thing, they'll be happy for him. Rogue is quiet, and he asks her to marry him. She's a whirlwind of emotions, but in the end, she says yes. So they gather everyone together at Book's bar, and when the Waldron brothers find out that he got their cousin pregnant, it's John Waldron who throws the first punch. And while being an immortal makes Redbridge immune to damage in the traditional sense, a whole separate idea is knockback damage. Knockback damage isn't actually damage at all. It just means the APs of force that you were hit with is going to move you a distance equal to that force minus your APs of weight. So when they punch Redbridge, he still gets moved backwards away from the punch. So he bumps into another guy holding a beer. And when the beer spills, that guy tries to punch Redbridge, who dodges, so the punch hits John Waldron, who, thanks to knockback damage, hits the guy at the billiards table, who then swings his pool cue, breaking it over Waldron's head, which gets the attention of the other Waldron brother, which in turn gets the police involved, especially when Boss Book owns the bar and the cops all work for Book. The Waldron brothers are arrested. Aunt Carrie yells at Redbridge and Rogue, telling them she hopes they're proud of themselves, and Rogue cries. Redbridge tries to get her to leave with him, but she goes back to the Waldron farm that night, where he is not welcome. After a sleepless night, Redbridge crushes a piece of coal into a diamond and uses it to pay the bail of the Waldron boys. But to them, that's a drop in the bucket, and they both tell him to leave town. They couldn't be more angry that he got their cousin pregnant. After that, Rogue goes to work and is tending bar when Redbridge walks in. She's still upset, and he asks her to elope. She doesn't want to. She loves her family, and this is her home. Redbridge, meanwhile, thinks of the old ones, and how they created him. And then one day they just left. So he doesn't want to create life, then just abandon his unborn son. But all of his powers are useless when it comes to solving this kind of a problem. He sees her family as the root of the problem, and to an extent, he also thinks that Caldecott County is the problem, and that if she would just leave, they could have a good life together. So he tries to make a charisma check again, and this time, when he rolls the dice, he gets double ones, which in DC Heroes is a critical failure. So Rogue gets mad, and from her point of view, he did this to her. And she doesn't ever want to, or he, sorry, I'm tongue tied. She thinks that he never wants her to see her family ever again. So she yells at him and she tells him that she never wants to see him ever again. So John Redbridge feels like he's finally defeated. And as much as he hates it, he leaves Mississippi. He heads to New Orleans, where Bob is, and he hopes that maybe Mardi Gras 1979 will cheer him up. But due to a strike, Mardi Gras is actually canceled that year. So Redbridge decides he just can't win. Which brings us to the epilogue. After 9 months, Anna Marie D'Incanto gives birth to a baby boy named Christopher D'Incanto, who has his mother's powers. But we also brought in the idea of the half celestial template from Dungeons and Dragons 3.0, which means his attributes are a bit better than his mom's, and he has a handful of things he's immune to, like acid, cold, disease, and electricity. He becomes a major superhero in our game world in the 1990s, and he absorbs so many powers from various characters, he actually becomes one of the most powerful beings in existence. But that's a story for another day. And that was it for this adventure. I liked this one in a way because, in my humble opinion, people are often overeager to accuse an original character of being a Mary Sue whenever they hear that character had anything go right for them. For sure, John Redbridge has been called a Mary Sue quite a few times over the years, mostly because he's an incredibly old RPG character who keeps leveling up. And in the RPG world, that makes these super old player characters fairly powerful and pretty competent. And a lot of people, especially ones who don't play the game every week or who are drive-by commentators, they don't see it when the hero can't save the day or when his life sucks for some reason. So, on that level, this game was a great illustration of that. I'm a dad myself, and if I had to live without my kids, it would be a fate worse than death. So, I thought it was interesting that this guy's an immortal now and he's completely immune to damage, and none of that helped him whatsoever. Despite everything, he was still completely powerless in this situation. And now he has to live without his son, which I think would be way more painful than any punch or laser beam could ever hope to be. So, because of all that, I thought this adventure was interesting. Hopefully, you thought it was interesting too. If so, as always, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, ring the bell, and leave a comment. From all of us here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope that all of you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.